Okay. Welcome everyone to the Women's Engineering Society's Electric Dream series of Heritage Open Days. I'm Helen Close and I'm the Heritage Manager for the Women's Engineering Society. Thank you so much for joining us today. Before we actually start, I'd just like to ask, can you mute your microphones so we don't get any dogs or Amazon deliveries being ding-donged in the background? We will be recording, so if you don't want to be seen, please turn off your cameras and change your names. It shouldn't come up on the screen, but you never know with these things whether things do pop up unexpectedly. And please drop any questions into the chat and we will have a chance to ask Anne these questions later. For those of you who don't know, the Women's Engineering Society was formed in 1919 in the aftermath of World War I, where women had been called to take up positions in industry and to fill the roles whilst the men were away at war, particularly in the engineering sector. When the war was over, the law required them to leave those jobs. Westwood was formed to help support and maintain women's roles in this sector, and it's still our role today. But unfortunately, it's still only 16.5% of the UK engineering workforce that are women. And we strive to change that and get to 50%. But how long that's going to take, I don't know. Every year, WES takes part in Heritage Open Days to share the history of some of our incredible women engineers with the public and to promote engineering as a viable career for young girls and women. This year, we are highlighting and celebrating the 100th anniversary of the formation of an offshoot or a splinter group or the daughter of WES, the Electrical Association for Women, and the role that women played in promoting electricity throughout the UK. And so I'd like to hand over to our guest speaker today, Anne Locker, who's going to tell us more about a particular individual.
Good afternoon, everyone. So thanks, Helen, for the introduction and welcome. And I'm Anne Locker, and I am the Library and Archives Manager at the IET, the Institution of Engineering and Technology. And we're fortunate enough to have the Women's Engineering Society archives here in the IET Library and Archives, as well as the archives of the Electrical Association for Women. And I have a chance to talk with you today about the electrical engineer, Margaret Partridge. Now, she is one of the few women working in power generation and supply in the early 20th century as an expert on rural electrification, and she was a key player in the early years of the Electrical Association for Women. She was also the first associate member of the IEE, which is now the IET. So she's a fascinating figure in the early history of women and engineering in the UK. And I'm just going to get back to my slides. And this is Margaret Partridge from a photograph in the WES Journal. Margaret was a pioneering woman engineer, a professional electrical engineer, and a leading figure in the rapidly growing sector of domestic electricity supply. And this year, we're celebrating the centenary of the foundation of the Electrical Association for Women. Margaret was a close friend of the first EAW director, Dame Caroline Hazlitt, and was responsible for much of the EAW's early outreach and branch activities, as well as writing extensively for the EAW Journal and the Electrical Handbook for Women. Throughout her career, Margaret focused on how to get electricity into people's homes. Along the way, she mentored young women in the engineering profession, caused considerable upset when she flouted the rules around women working alone at night, and supervised her last electrical lighting project after her retirement by getting a group of women to wire up her local WI village hall. Her career shows how women could interact with the new science of electricity supply, not as passive consumers, but as experts. And this is really her focus on training women and getting them the knowledge and the expertise they needed to use electricity in the home properly. So let me just go back to so I've just lost my slides here. Here we are. So this is this is the census, which shows Margaret Partridge when she was still living at home. So a little bit about her biography. Margaret Partridge was born in Devon in 1891. The family later moved to Bedford, where she was educated at the High School Bedford and then enrolled at Bedford College to study mathematics, helped by 2 scholarships. And we can see in this early census form, and this is from the census of 1911, that she had two big advantages in her early education. The first is that her father, and he's there as John Partridge, was a man of independent means, so there was some cash to help with education. The second is that Margaret, being a girl, didn't seem to make any difference to her prospects, so her sister is listed as a medical student. So this was a family that believed in educating its daughters. And Margaret certainly didn't lack in confidence, which was to be massively helpful in overcoming obstacles in her choice of career in engineering. And Margaret was also supported by her supervisor and tutor at Bedford College, where she studied mathematics. The principal of Bedford College, Miss Tuke, kept in touch with her college alumni, and we can see in the Bedford College archives that she wrote 2 letters of recommendation for Margaret, one for her brief foray into teaching. She decided she didn't like it and then went into engineering instead, and the second in 1915 when she applied for a job with a London-based engineering firm. In fact, in her first letter, Miss Tuke had written, there's a quote here, she's a good organiser and can be relied upon to carry out thoroughly and efficiently any work which she undertakes. And also, she is likely to prove successful in a non-scholastic post, in which her powers as an organiser will have scope. So in the First World War, more opportunities for young women opened up in engineering. As Helen said, this was the first time that many women had the opportunity to go into engineering works. By 1917, Margaret was on the move, and she wrote to Miss Tuke, "I'm glad to tell you I have work again. It's in the testing department of Messrs. Lyons and Wrench, and I think the chief work will be testing dynamos and small petrol engines. It sounds though it will be pretty interesting, and I'm assured I'll have every opportunity of learning all about the construction of everything made in the factory." Margaret rose to the role of supervisor, and she remembered fondly her wartime experiences. Writing in The Woman Engineer, "The work was hard, it was dirty, and we wore hideous trouser overalls. Nevertheless, the spirit in our works was good, and though our free time was limited, we found much amusement there." After the war ended, there was little likelihood of a woman being kept on or finding another engineering post. So Margaret decided to set up her own engineering business, and she also joined the newly formed Women's Engineering Society. And here is an advert in the Woman Engineer Journal for her company in 1922, M. Partridge & Co. Domestic Engineers, and she's got this great slogan, "Women for Women's Work." In 1921, Margaret wrote to her friend Caroline Hazlitt, who was the first secretary of Women's Engineering Society, but for family reasons she had to move back to Devon, and we now know that she moved so she could care for her elderly mother. But she didn't want to give up on her engineering career, and so set up her engineering company with a partner, Miss Leese. Interestingly, Miss Leese, although we don't know a lot about her, we do know that she gained her own engineering experience at the Galloway Motor Company, a company that was really important, again, for getting women into engineering in World War I, and which actively recruited women into its works. Now, we need to rewind a little bit here to talk about the state of electricity supply in the UK in the 1920s. The first electrical plants in the UK to supply domestic houses were linked to larger and more affluent homes, like the hydroelectric scheme, designed and built by Lord Armstrong at Cragside in Northumberland in 1880. There were some speculative small-scale networks that supplied multiple homes based on lower voltage DC direct current supply, like Robert Hammond's 1882 scheme in Brighton and Colonel Crompton's 1886 scheme in Kensington. The electric lighting was relatively expensive, especially compared to municipal gas, and was out of the reach of most people. And here is an illustration of Deptford Generating Station, which was in South London. Because by the end of the 19th century, engineers like Sebastian de Ferranti in London and Charles Mertz in Newcastle were building new kinds of supply schemes that would be more recognisable to us today. They comprised large power stations generating AC supply, alternating current, higher voltage, and could be transmitted over longer distances, built near water and cheap sources of fuel, so they could supply a larger area of urban housing, plus factories, railways, and other industries. Helped by the new technology of a Parsons steam turbine, these schemes made electricity much more affordable and widespread, but they didn't translate easily outside the city or the large town. In 1919, the first electricity bodies for joint electricity authorities in the UK were created to encourage larger regional electricity schemes, but participation was voluntary, and this was a gap that wouldn't be bridged until the development of a national grid in 1948. And it's in this in-between period of the 1920s and 1930s that Margaret did most of her professional work. So, if you're in the early 1920s and you're a small rural town or village with really progressive ideas, you want to try electricity supply. But you're not going to be linked very easily to an existing scheme, so you need professional help. And this is where Margaret Partridge's company came in. According to the woman engineer, and we saw the advert earlier, Partridge set up as a domestic engineer in Exeter in 1921. And in 1922, and this is kind of foreshadowed the development of the Electrical Association for Women, she organised an electricity exhibition, which attracted a good deal of notice in Exeter and was visited by people from all parts of Devon. The exhibition included a display of labour-saving devices designed to interest and intrigue the housewives of Exeter. In a 1923 article in The Woman Engineer, Margaret writes about starting a business for something to do, and she reminds her readers that being a woman is not necessarily a disadvantage, as potential clients are not likely to forget you. And there's a recipe here that she publishes in the journal, which is the recipe for production of a small business. And she says, take the impudence of a small monkey, the epidermis of a hippopotamus, the patience of an elephant, the energy of an ant, a good business address, a long-suffering landlord, lots of publicity, good introductions, a modicum of knowledge on the job, and as much capital as possible to make a successful business. But Margaret had a bit of a problem. She had to convince the local councils that she was the best person to set up rural electricity schemes. And in this, she was helped by another engineer and supporter of Women's Engineering Society, the engineer John Purvis. Purvis had already set up a number of electricity schemes in Scotland and the southwest of England, and in 1927 he acquired a franchise to supply Bampton with electricity. This was in Devon. He proposed that Margaret's firm should take on the work, and after some rather tense local meetings, this was agreed. Her company also set up electricity supply in the village of Forvedon in Devon and Bungay in Suffolk. The Suffolk enterprise was helped by the fact that the alderman of Bungay, Rosalind Messenger, was Caroline Hazlitt's sister. Negotiating supply contracts and carrying out the design, installation and maintenance was not, as you might guess, straightforward. We've got a fantastic window into the trials and tribulations of a rural electrical engineer in a series of letters in the archives which were written by Margaret to her friend Caroline Hazlitt. And we can see one of these, if I can get it up on the screen, next. So this is a letter. It's probably not easy to read on screen, but it's written by Margaret to Caroline, and there isn't a date, and she's written date and day unknown, night approaches, the second since I ceased to take note of time. So she's really in the thick of things, getting this electricity scheme to work. And she writes, Bampton's alight, really alight, and generally speaking, our Herculean efforts have been rewarded. And she says, last Monday, we moved the wheels around for the first time, cataclysms, bursts, belts, smashed bolts, all sorts of melodrama. But everything was mostly fixed, and the town was lit. And she writes, my dear, for sheer exciting experience, give me a town to light. 70-mile-an-hour belts and 320 volts on the board of a well-soaped cement floor. And then remember you're the responsible engineer for the whole lot, and there isn't another soul within 20 miles at least who understands the switchboard. But there were negative sides to these new schemes. In another letter, which was written after the company had completed several small supply schemes, she writes, "Don't ever take a holiday if you run a contracting business, unless you want to store up for a good fight." And I like that this letter starts with a bit of a cry for help. And she said, "When bursting with rage and fury and nerve storms, I suppose you tell FS, who was a good friend of Caroline Hazlitt, what you think of him. I, on the other hand, smoke fast and write to you." So she sit there kind of chain smoking, getting kind of all het up about all the things that are going on with her scheme and writing to Caroline Hazlitt. And she talks about the problems. There was a court summons for unpaid bills, there were complaints from Bampton, and she said, "I can't quite think what they've got to grouse about, but they just said that they don't like the way things have been done." And in a new scheme in South Molton, there was a man who threatened to cut down some wires because he didn't like the look of them. There were lighter moments too. So again in Bampton, this is an account, again from a letter to Caroline Hazlitt, where they dug a hole and they had to leave it overnight. They were about to erect an electricity pole, and they put some lanterns around it for health and safety. And she said, "Later in the evening, the unusual sight aroused the curiosity of a passer-by who went to see what the light was for. He soon found out, and if you've ever fallen into a pit 5 feet deep by 1 foot wide, even when sober, you'll appreciate his dilemma." So as an electricity contractor, Margaret also wanted to encourage other young women to go into the profession. We know of at least 3 women apprentices that she employed: Kathleen Bunker, Muriel Mott and Beatrice Schilling. And the last would go on to work as an engineer at Farnborough on the Merlin engine. Margaret really liked Beatrice, and she said, and this is a quote from, again, a letter to Caroline Hazlitt, "I've managed to give Beatrice Schilling over a week's wiring work, and it seems to be turning out a great success. I really think she's a great acquisition to the firm, able to enjoy any new experience and not in the least superior or blasé, for fault of the very young at times. She has a wicked joy in making all the YWCA hostels stand their hair on end by tales of her unladylike exploits with wiring." Incidentally, at the end of this letter to Caroline that we saw earlier, Margaret mentions that Beatrice has wired a house in Paradise and says, "I told her that she should write an article for you, how I lighted the house in Paradise, with illustrations." And the article was duly written and published. So, and we should have a copy of it here. Here we go. So this is from the journal Electrical Age, and it's called A Page for Girl Guides, How We Wired a House in Paradise by Beatrice Schilling and Mona Willis. And it's got illustrations, and I particularly like these 2 illustrations. The first is of the engineer, the hazards of climbing a ladder and then it falling down in front of you. Actually, that's on the right, and she had to hang on to the electric light fitting. And the second is accidentally coming through the ceiling when working in the roof. So this was in the publication of the Electrical Age, which was the journal of the Electrical Association for Women. And Margaret's work in Devon had showed her there was a challenge with rural electrification. So it wasn't just about persuading villages and towns if they wanted electricity, but how did you persuade the women in the home that they would benefit from electricity themselves? Now, we've already seen that Margaret had put on a display of domestic appliances in Exeter for local housewives. But in 1923, the electrical engineer Margaret Mabel Matthews presented a paper on the subject to the Institution of Electrical Engineers, and she was proposing the formation of a new association to promote electricity in the home. Now, the IEE weren't particularly interested, and nor were the Electrical Development Association, but the Women's Engineering Society took it on. And in 1924, they published Mabel's paper. And in November 1924, the president of the Women's Engineering Society, Lady Parsons, hosted a meeting which would end up with the formation of a new organisation called the Women's Electrical Association. Caroline Hazlitt was the first director, and Margaret Partridge was a founder member. The organisation was later renamed the Electrical Association for Women, and you can find out more about its history on the IT Archives website. The aims of the new organisation were to get women to use electricity in the home and also to lobby industry to meet women's needs. And here we can see a page from one of the early journals. Margaret was heavily involved from the start, focusing on the need to educate women to be mindful and intelligent consumers, experts in their own fields. One of the first activities the EAW did was to give public lectures on electricity, and initially these were all given by Margaret. She spoke on electricity, tariffs, and the issues around electricity supply in rural areas. Margaret's lectures went down really well with the public. There's an account in the Electrical Age of a 1925 lecture in Birmingham, which describes how everyone was so enthusiastic about her technical demonstrations that, and this is a quote, if I can get to the first slide, here we go. Oh, sorry, no, there isn't actually a quote there, so let me just get back to my notes. But she said that the women present were very anxious to know how to mend their fuses. And in fact, one member suggested that no one should be allowed to leave the conference hall until she could prove that the mending of a fuse was no longer a matter of great mystery to her. I like this idea of basically holding all the people hostage until they show they can actually be competent in managing their electricity supplies. When the new association started its own journal, Margaret was a regular contributor. Her first article, and we do have a copy of that here, just get back to that, is for Girl Guides, and it's called When the Light Fails, and it slightly alarmingly gave instructions for identifying and fixing fault in electric lighting. And she says, when the lights go off, it is not unusual for weak-nerved people to scream and lose their heads. She says, not so, of course, for a well-trained guide or amateur electrician. She will not dash for outside help, nor will she sit patiently suffering in the dark. What she should do when the electricity has been switched off is examine the lamps and consider rewiring the light or checking and rewiring the fuses. Other articles in this vein included Doctoring the Vacuum, Fancies in Fans, That Iron, ! And The Domesticated Motor. And in these articles, we can see Margaret's continued emphasis on technical knowledge and expertise. She isn't focusing on why women should choose electricity, but on the fact they should be informed and competent when faced with the new technology. And this is a copy of the Domesticated Motor. And this idea that as a girl guide, one of your best birthday presents could be getting a new electric motor that you can play with. Yeah, not quite sure how practical that would be. So the focus on technical knowledge and personal competence can be seen in another EAW project, the Electrical Handbook for Women. The handbook contained a large amount of technical information on domestic electricity, electrical appliances, and in the early editions, advice for showroom demonstrators. Margaret wrote the technical sections for these early editions. Now, Margaret's career as an independent contractor would be massively affected by the development of the national grid in 1948, which included the compulsory purchase of smaller schemes like Margaret's village schemes, and the move to a national system of electricity generation and distribution. And as a woman, she was far less likely to be employed by the national boards. Her work was also affected, of course, by the Second World War. At the outbreak of war, Margaret followed her fellow WES members, including Verena Holmes, into a government post, and she became a technical advisor on the employment of women in munitions. And she had got into a bit of an argument with the International Labour Organization on flouting rules designed to protect women from unfair working conditions, because one of her apprentices, Gertrude Schilling, was discovered working on her own at night. This led to a revision of the regulations with negotiations led by Caroline Hazlitt. And what happened is it didn't stop women being forbidden from working on their own at night, but there was an exemption. So that if you were working as a supervisory engineer, then you were allowed to work on your own when it was dark. Margaret retired after the war, but she didn't stop her electrical work altogether. Oops, sorry, let me just go back to that. In her last article in The Woman Engineer, she describes how she and a group of local women have taken on the job of wiring the new village hall. And she says, our electric girls this time may not prove as adaptable as those 30 years ago. Nearly all are mothers, some are grandmothers, and none aspire to be engineers beyond what is needed to do their own home repairs. So we welcome any outside help that we can get. So Margaret Partridge managed to run a successful engineering business at a time when few women were working in the area of rural electricity generation and supply. She was instrumental in setting up the new organisation of the Electrical Association for Women to promote electricity in the home, and throughout her career found time to write entertaining and instructive articles for her fellow engineers, Keen Girl guides and domestic consumers. So how did she do it? She had a supportive family who prioritised her education. So she was able to train as an engineer in wartime when many barriers to women entering the profession had been removed. And she had the connections and capital. I mean, mostly she does mourn that she's winning contracts worth thousands with only £10 in the bank. But she was able to set up her own business. So she had a lot of advantages. But she also made the most of her networks. She used her connections with Women's Engineering Society to find investors, and she built friendships with fellow engineers like John Purvis to establish her face as an engineering contractor. She helped to make the Electrical Association for Women a success, and she worked as a technical officer in World War II under fellow WES members. Margaret was a success, but she also gave back, writing articles, travelling the country to give talks and demonstrations, although she does mutter about wasting hours demonstrating electricity to small boys, and doing her best to ensure women had accurate and understandable information about the electricity that had come into their homes. And this letter is actually written, talking to Caroline Hassett about one of the talks that she gave. And she pointed out she had to sit in a very wobbly stage. So whenever she moved or sat down, she kind of bumped the chair up, who was sitting at the other end of the stage. So her supply schemes are long gone. And those who remember the first glimmers of electric light in Bankton may no longer be with us, but we still have her letters and articles, which so clearly and amusingly document the life and work of an extraordinary engineer. So thank you for your time today. We've got plenty of time for questions. Let me just stop sharing my screen if I can do that. There we go. For sharing and stop sharing. There we are. So we should be able to see everybody again today.
Comments as well. Thank you so much, Anne. That was very informative. Yeah, she certainly seems to have been a character, doesn't she?
Yeah. But I would say is there's a lot of information on Margaret Partridge out there. And also what I should have mentioned is for the electrical engineer, the Electrical Association for Women Journal of the Electrical Age has been fully digitised and it's available online. So if you go to the IT Archives page, you can see a link there and actually download all the PDFs of the Electrical Age, which goes from 1926 right the way through to 1986. So it is a fantastic source of information on women and electricity in that period of time.
Yeah, as well. So
and enjoy the rest of your your week as it is and your weekend.
Thank you, Corrine.